This is a Suno India production.
എനിക്ക് നീതി കിട്ടണം, അത് മാത്രമേ എനിക്ക് പറയാനുള്ളൂ. ഷഫിൻ ജഹാൻ എന്റെ ഹസ്ബൻഡാണ്. ഷഫിൻ ജഹാൻ ഞാൻ എന്റെ ഇഷ്ടപ്രകാരം ആരും എന്നെ നിർബന്ധിച്ച് മതം മാറ്റിയതല്ല.
As per Indian tradition, the custody of an unmarried daughter is with the parents until she is properly married. That's the Kerala High Court in Ashokan KM versus the Superintendent of Police, more popularly known as the Hadiya case. This case took the nation by storm in 2017. And in the middle of the storm was Hadiya, a 24-year-old medical student whose conversion to Islam and marriage to a Muslim man came under the scrutiny of the state. The case revolved around recognizing a woman's freedom and agency. And what it highlighted was that a woman's personal liberty is subject to sanction from the state, the court, her parents, and society at large. Hadiya's case brings to light the limits of a woman's choice. But these issues are not new to India and have plagued it from its very inception. In today's episode, we will explore the Constituent Assembly's discussions in the legislation of marriage, family, and women's choices.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Contested Nation, a podcast that discusses how the Constitution of India was written and how that remains relevant for India and Indianness today. This is Shruti, your host.
Marriage in India is considered an inevitable reality, an urgent necessity, really, once one hits adulthood. And at its core, it represents a tension between the exercise of individual choice and as an institution that maintains gender, caste, and class hierarchies. This conflict between individual choice and community was one that the assembly members debated at great length. The very first legislation that formally allowed any kind of interfaith marriage in India was one enacted by the colonial administration in 1872, called the Special Marriage Act. However, the act required individuals to either renounce their religion entirely and embrace atheism or convert to the other person's religion. Dr. Ambedkar, in The Annihilation of Caste, argues for intercaste marriage as an important way to abolish untouchability and caste differences. This idea is also endorsed by organizations such as the Satyashodak Samaj, a social reform society founded by Jyotiba Phule. And the belief here was that intercaste marriages would create a feeling of kith and kin, promote feelings of fraternity, that elusive constitutional value. Joining us today to discuss this episode is Madhavi Menon. Madhavi is a professor of English and director of the Center for Studies in Gender and Sexuality at Ashoka University. She's the author of several books on queer theory, most recently, Infinite Variety, A History of Desire in India, and The Law of Desire, Rulings on Sex and Sexuality in India. Hello and welcome to the podcast, Madhavi. We're really glad to have you here today. So let's begin, Madhavi, by talking about this tension between the definition of marriage as something done out of love, out of an individual's choice or desire, and the existence of marriage as an institution that maintains socio-cultural hierarchies.
I actually don't really subscribe to it. I don't think there's a tension. I think whether it's so called love marriage, that's the term we use in India, as you know, or it is an arranged marriage, which is by far and away the norm. Whether it's love marriage or arranged marriage, the institution of marriage itself is in order to keep certain social forces in check. So, no matter how one does it, marriage to me is not necessarily the panacea that people might think it is going to be. Precisely. And, people think, and I know you referred to this even in your opening comments, when Ambedkar says in The Annihilation of Caste that intercaste marriages are the best way to get rid of the caste system. And I think I completely agree with where he's coming from, but not necessarily in the way that he articulates it, which is to say, I think, yes, there is something deeply interesting to consider desire as a way of undoing hierarchies. But I don't think marriage is the way to undo hierarchies, because I think it only further entrenches them. So, if perhaps had he been born 20 or 30 years later, Ambedkar might have said, intercaste desire is the best way to get rid of the caste system. And I would completely subscribe to that. But intercaste marriage to me seems as not as, but seems to be stuck also in the premise that marriage as a state sanctioned construct is something that one requires in order to validate one's desire. So, marriage is not the thing that I think can set us free, although I do think it can enslave us. And I think it continues to enslave us in many ways. So, there's idea of, what is the tension between love marriage and arranged marriage? To me, the tension is the word marriage itself, which is common to both these phenomena. And that can be seen most clearly in instances in which so called love marriages bring down the wrath of the law and the might of the state, precisely because it is defying the thing that marriage is meant to be, which is a form of social control. So, the kinds of violence that, let's say, intercaste marriage elicits, or that sort of interreligious marriage elicits, or that, this complicated calculus of what gotra is allowed and what is not, that's also part of the caste calculus. The kinds of quote unquote utterly misnamed honor killings in order to maintain one's honor, it's because marriage is commonly understood as the thing that will maintain one's honor. And so when marriage fails to perform that task, when it fails to fulfill that duty, that's when it elicits violences of the kinds that we see rampantly all over the Indian subcontinent, perhaps more in some places than others, but certainly all over. So, this idea that some marriages are better than others is something that I think is at the root of our problem, because I think unless we begin to see marriage itself for what it is, which is a form of social control exerted by the state upon us, we're not actually going to be able to get very far in this conversation or very far in this discussion. Because as you yourself know, and again, this is an example of what happens when people, society, the state is confronted with a marriage that is not doing what marriage is meant to do. So, if you look, let's say, at an interreligious marriage, um, all the legal provisions for interreligious marriages. I mean, first of all, you need to ask, why do they need to be legal provisions for interreligious marriage? Why can't people get married if they want to, regardless of what their religion is? The very fact that you have a Special Marriages Act to govern interfaith marriage, interreligious marriage, should alert us to the fact that this marriage is not actually that neutral prima facie as it is presented as being. It is, in fact, deeply rooted in caste hierarchy, religious separation, and and certain kind of gender and sexual politics that are deeply problematic to my mind. And of course, I'm happy to talk more about this, but I was just sort of trying to give you an overview about how I think the tension lies in marriage itself rather than in particular kinds of marriage.
That's not the direction I thought we were going to go in today's conversation, but it is a very interesting start to it. So let's explore this idea of desire a little bit. And let's assume, Madhavi, that tomorrow we wake up in a society where marriage as an institution doesn't exist anymore, but caste, gender, patriarchy, all these forces still exist. And what people are looking for is desire, not marriage. So, in your opinion, what happens to transgressive desire? So, the institution of marriage is no longer there. But what happens to desire that crosses caste norms? What happens to desire that crosses religious norms? Is it treated in the same way?
I love that question precisely. I mean, I love conjectural questions because then you get off the leash, right, and you can imagine creatively other ways of being in the world. Unfortunately, though, with this conjectural question, it's an impossibility actually because I think you're absolutely right in saying if it isn't marriage, might it be something else that is used to regulate and keep in place systems of caste and patriarchy and religious difference? And I think absolutely. And that something can be called desire, it can be called prison, it can be called whatever it is, that there has to be something. Because it is actually an impossibility to have a society, by which I mean a social structure governed by norms and rules and laws, that allows desire free reign. So either you have a structure, as Hobbes said, where life is nasty, brutish, and short, where desire runs rampant and there's absolutely no curbs on it or no controls over it. But that is not a society. And he was, of course, famously talking in the Leviathan about a social structure, about setting up a social state. The minute you're talking about a social structure, you're talking about a social structure that is premised on controlling people's desires. So one can't, in fact, take out one aspect of society and say, will that change everything? Because they're too closely interwoven, they're too closely tied together, and sort of insidiously tied together, that if you unravel one part of the fabric, either you are prepared to unravel the whole thing, or you're just going to continue with the fabric as is, and no one's going to miss that one little thread that has come out. So, no, I think just getting rid of marriage is not going to get rid of all the other stuff that we have. If it isn't marriage, there'd be some other way of controlling desire. But what is interesting in this kind of thought experiment is that the enemy seems to be, whether or not it is marriage that is used to control it, the enemy does seem to be desire in whatever way one describes it, whether it is sort of unconscious, whether it is conscious, whether it's something that we are aware of, that other people around us are aware of, whether it is sanctioned or whether it is not. I think desire in and of itself is what is the word that you used? I think you sort of said not reactionary. The desire in and of itself is capable of undoing structures of sociality. And the minute it is capable of undoing structures of sociality, that means it has slipped the noose. It has slipped the leash of the social itself. And therefore, it can have no place within the social. So, if we are going to continue talking about the social fabric or social structure, then we can't talk about desire other than in a tamed form. The minute we start talking about desire in an untamed form, then you're no longer talking about society.
I know you're not a huge fan of marriage, but we're going to stick with marriage for just a little bit longer in this conversation. And I want to talk about the fundamental right to marry, which almost, just almost, made it to the Indian Constitution. No impediments to marriage between citizens shall be based merely upon difference of religion. This was a clause proposed by Minu Masani in the Fundamental Rights Subcommittee. Masani was a Parsi politician, a Gandhian, and eventually became a member of the Swatantra Party. He was a staunch believer in the ideals of secularism and liberty. He was joined in this proposal by Rajkumari Amrit Kaur, Mrs. Hansa Mehta, and Dr. Ambedkar himself. Rajkumari Amrit Kaur was a Gandhian and women's rights advocate, and she herself had a history of mixed faith. Her father was born Sikh, converted to Christianity before marrying her mother, and she herself, despite being a practicing Protestant Christian, was cremated according to Sikh customs. Hansa Mehta was a leading feminist and social activist who went on to be the face of India at the UN Human Rights Commission. Mehta and Kaur were instrumental in the All India Women's Conference and had long advocated for gender equality, women's education, and women's liberty. The vote to pass this fundamental right to marry was lost by a narrow 5-4 margin in the Fundamental Rights Subcommittee. And it was never really discussed within the full Constituent Assembly itself. Masani, Mehta, and Kaur, however, they wrote a note of dissent and wrote that an impediment to marriage between two Indians is a reflection of our claim to a common nationhood. So, Madhvi, let's engage in a bit of fantasy here. Let's assume that this fundamental right to marriage, and I know you're not a fan of the institution, but let's assume that this fundamental right to marriage passed within the Fundamental Rights Subcommittee and within the larger Constituent Assembly. How would that have changed the course of independent India, if at all? Or would it have been one of those rights that's on paper alone?
I completely get and understand why you want to stay within the framework of marriage, within, the sort of debates of the Constituent Assembly. But I'm going to say actually that the people who voted against this seemingly wonderfully broad minded and liberal proposition of not putting any impediment to marriage between citizens of India, I'm going to suggest that the people who voted against it were actually understood something about marriage, which is that it is based on impediments. So you can't actually say marriage without impediments because that simply does not exist. It does not make any sense. And so the idea that marriage should exist without impediments is like saying the human beings should breathe without oxygen. It just cannot happen. The idea of marriage, and let's just think about it, right? If in fact there should be no impediment to any two citizens cohabiting, having a sexual relationship, having a romantic relationship, sharing inheritance, sharing wealth, why should there be marriage? Why can't it just be no impediment? Marriage itself is an impediment. To suddenly saying marriage without impediment does not make sense. It tries to have the best of both worlds without actually succeeding and actually being quite intellectually lazy in the bargain. So the people who voted against this, I'm sure many of them just sort of knee jerk conservatives, most of them not thinking rigorously or intellectually or even politically. So I'm not necessarily saying that they voted against it for the right reasons, but I'm saying their vote against it allows us to think about marriage itself and what it is, what its very existence is meant to provoke and meant to prove. And it's not meant to provoke or prove a life without impediment.
This tension between religious or community practices and individual choice was seen not only in the clause on marriage, but also found its way in other issues too. The Uniform Civil Code, the right to freely profess religion. While the Constituent Assembly was debating Article 25, which guarantees the right to freely profess, practice, and propagate religion, some members worried that this right may impede legislation against customs such as child marriage, sati, unequal inheritance rights for women, etc. Many wondered, could religion serve as a hindrance to social reform? The assembly tried to allay these fears by including a restriction on this right, which stated, or which allowed the state really, to provide for social reform, including reforms such as temple entry reforms, even if it contradicted practice of religion. There were some radical suggestions within the assembly. There was a member who suggested that religion should be entirely a private matter, and even names which indicated religious or caste background should be abolished in public life. Dr. Ambedkar pointed out that India had already adopted uniform codes in the form of a common criminal procedure code, in the form of tort laws. But it was the uniform regulation of personal laws alone that led to much debate within the assembly. Ultimately, the assembly members recognized that religion in India was not merely a private individual matter, but one that strongly governed our public lives. The question that the assembly struggled with was, how do you articulate the identity of the Indian without hurting the identity of the Hindu or the Muslim or the Sikh? Madhavi, what is your take on this constitutional tightrope? Where, on the one hand, the Constitution defines, protects individual rights, but on the other, it doesn't go too far in articulating the primacy of the individual in the personal sphere.
Clearly, that radical member of the Constituent Assembly must have been my ancestor of some kind. since all the suggestions I make are also probably going to be poo-pooed, but I absolutely agree. I think religion should be private, and sex should be public. Frankly, I think those two should be made to swap places. And I do think we should get rid of caste names because they always exist for a purpose, and that purpose is not a benign one at all. Having said that, a couple of things that I'd like to say. One is that the very notion, and I talk about this in my book, The Law of Desire, the very notion of quote unquote personal law or the realm of personal laws is a relatively new one. It is very much a colonial construct, and it's very much a colonial construct premised on a deep suspicion of Indians themselves. And so anything in which the British colonial masters thought that people of the subcontinent were governed by practice or customs, they sort of said, okay, that's your private matter. And that, so then that became part of personal law, i.e., marriage, death, inheritance, and everything else which they considered uh, should be ruled by rationality and logic and superior judgment was brought under the realm of British law, right? Including, of course, desire, as 377 across the British Empire will testify to. So there is a way in which, by repeating this terminology of personal law or private law versus public law, we are just repeating a terminology that we have inherited from the British and that we need to be a little more careful about and a little more sort of meditate on a little bit further. Having said that, the history of personal laws in India under British ruled India and then post independence has actually seen a very, very strange trajectory in terms of religion, gender, and caste along all these lines. And let me just sort of speak briefly about all three of them, which are all of which are interrelated. So I'm not going to be saying one, two, and three, but I'll just sort of give you a couple of examples. So there is a way in which all this talk about the Uniform Civil Code. This is Article 44 of the Constitution, says that a uniform civil code is an aspirational ideal towards which the country should move. And as we know, a certain kind of Hindutva majoritarian practice that is ascendant in the country today is very much in favor of a uniform civil code, which always amuses me because actually a uniform civil code is going to impinge far more on the so-called Hindu majority than it is going to impinge on any minorities, as the Shabrimala judgment makes very clear that in fact the number of restrictions on the basis of religion that are enacted by, as I said, the umbrella term of Hinduism along lines of gender and caste exceed by far any other religious restrictions belonging to people from non umbrella Hindu religions. So perhaps that's one of the reasons why the Uniform Civil Code is not always talked about with as much zeal, shall we say, as other Hindutva matters dear to Hindutva hearts, because it actually is not going to affect, it's not going to be the stick with which to beat minority religions as effectively as other sticks that Hindutva majoritarians would like to wield. So the Uniform Civil Code, and as you know, with the Shabrimala judgment, again about which I have written quite extensively, the Shabrimala judgment was a blow on all fronts, right? It was a blow against gender inequality, patriarchy, against caste inequality, which actually the Ayyappan temple in Shabrimala already is. It is one of the few temples in India where caste doesn't matter and never has mattered. It's one of the few temples in India in which religion has not mattered and never mattered. In fact, one of the shrines that you are supposed to worship at before you reach Ayyappan's shrine in Shabrimala belongs to Babar, a Muslim pirate who was meant to be deeply attached to and devoted to Ayyappan. So it was a casteless, communal-less temple. But of course, gender then rears its ugly head. And so the government of India, including the prime minister, elected prime minister of this land, said they would not uphold the Supreme Court judgment allowing women of menstruating age to enter the Shabrimala temple through the front steps. So that is just one indicator of how much a certain kind of Hindutva majoritarianism is actually going to resist the idea of a uniform civil code. So usually, and again, this is sort of lazy intellectualism and lazy politics. When people hear the phrase uniform civil code, they say, "Oh, it's the minorities are not going to want that." But if anybody sort of looks even briefly at the history of so-called personal laws just in the last, let's say, 100 years, 150 years, they will see that on every count, just to sort of say compare Muslims and Hindus, Muslims have had far greater freedoms in so-called sphere of personal laws than Hindus have, which is what actually necessitated the entire slew of Hindu reform bills in the 1950s, including banning polygamy, which was practiced at a much higher percentage among Hindus than among Muslims. A sort of conservative estimates puts it at 5.8% among Hindus, 5.7% at among Muslims. So there is a way in which the reform of so-called personal laws actually needs to be done much more, as all your examples make clear. Child marriage, sati, widow remarriage, all of them make clear, all your examples make clear, are mandated by a certain kind of caste Hindutva, which is deeply entrenched in keeping women in their place, in keeping lower caste people in their place, and keeping other religions at bay. So, this notion of what do you do between the public and the private, I think, again, is one of those notions that we actually need to think about with a fresh eye rather than merely regurgitating those terms, and actually thinking about what it might be that we are allowing religion to take over, whether we are paying too high a price for allowing religion to take it over, and what that price might be. I believe that allowing religion to run rampant and riot, quite literally, across the subcontinent is a very, very bad idea. And so, but rather than saying such and such a religion is bad or such and such a religious practice is outlawed, one could say religion is entirely private and there's not going to be a single public matter that is going to be governed by it. That's what it means to be a secular nation. A secular nation doesn't mean you have one religion governing everybody else. A secular nation means all religions are equal, but they should be equally practiced in private, and nobody should have any business interfering with anybody else's religious practice unless it leads to violence of some kind or the other.
1951, in the Indian Parliament, a bill was introduced, which is famous now and well known by name Hindu Code Bill. And Dr. Ambedkar, being a law minister, he had to pilot the bill. And Hindu Code Bill, in short, is meant for emancipation of women from the slavery of Hindu society. And as such, he had great attachment and devotion to this bill, and he worked hard to see that it passes through during his tenure as a law minister.
This discussion on personal laws dominated Parliament soon after the passing of the Indian Constitution with the introduction of the Hindu Code Bill. The Hindu Code Bill was introduced in Parliament in 1951 to codify Hindu personal law. The bill included a number of rights for women, such as rights in the joint family property, a provision for divorce, provisions for a civil marriage. Despite having Nehru's ardent support, the bill met with bitter opposition. Predictably, the opposition came on the abolition of caste restrictions in marriage and adoption, opposition to divorce, to equal and absolute property rights of women. Rajendra Prasad, the chairman of the assembly, was a strong opponent of the bill and is even said to have remarked that it was only overeducated, westernized women who favored this bill. The delay in passing the bill and the bitterness surrounding it saw the resignation of Dr. Ambedkar as law minister and his withdrawal from formal political life. So, Madhavi touched upon the Hindu Code Bill slightly earlier in our conversation. Clearly very contentious, especially the bits that guarantee greater rights for women. In fact, someone sarcastically labels the bill the Hindu Women's Code Bill at one point. My question, Madhvi, is if Indian society today is any different from society in 1951 in how it approaches individual rights, especially women's rights.
Well, I mean, one of the ways in which it has clearly changed is that despite the prime minister supporting something, Parliament can reject it, and there can be a bitter and wholehearted debate about an issue, which doesn't seem to be happening now. So certainly, the sort of erosion of democracy in terms of parliamentary debate is very evident in everything that you have just described as the scenario in the 1950s in relation to the scenario today. In relation to women's rights, I think the distinction is less clear cut. Actually, I think we might be a bit worse off today than we were in the 1950s because, as you were saying earlier, people like Rajkumari Amrit Kaur, Hansa Mehta were all very, very strong um, leaders who advocated for women's rights. I'm hard pressed to find any woman leader, elected leader or in government today, who's actually pushing for women's rights. In fact, you remember famously Sushma Swaraj, a minister in the previous cabinet, actually described a woman who's a victim of rape as zinda lash, as a living corpse. So, and the sort of maleness of the ruling party honchos does not give one much hope for women's rights today. Again, if you take a more recent example than Hadiya, on Independence Day, just as the Prime Minister was saying, "Oh, we must not undermine women's rights," the men who gang raped Bilkis Bano and murdered her 3-year-old daughter and killed 11 members of her family are not only allowed to go free, but are also garlanded and feted and fed sweets. And this, to me, is an absolute shock. It is a shocking mode of behavior. I don't know enough, but I'm going to hazard a guess that such a turn of events would not have happened in the 1950s.
On this podcast, we keep coming back to this idea of constitutional morality. And to me, that's really what it comes down to. If society deems certain kinds of violence against women acceptable, if it deems that women are not worthy of certain rights, then no amount of constitutional protections will be enough. But before we end today's conversation, I want to go back to Hadiya one last time. And my question is, what if Hadiya had been a man? Would the state, the courts have treated her the same way?
Would it have happened if she was a man? Absolutely not. And as you know, Shruti, whether it was in the Kerala High Court or in the Supreme Court, Hadiya was not allowed to speak. No one actually asked her what she thought. No one asked her what her opinion was about matters that as they were going on. She's 24 years old, we remember, in 2016. She's 26 by the time it gets to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court proceedings begin not including her at all. And then finally, Indira Jaising suggests, well, shouldn't we hear from Hadiya? And then the Supreme Court judges, all men, say, oh yeah, maybe we should. And then for the first time, she was allowed to speak, and she was utterly articulate and eloquent in speaking in her own behalf. So this was 2018, the year in which a number of quote unquote progressive judgments were passed. Asking Hadiya to speak in court in her own behalf was an afterthought that was had to be prodded on by a woman lawyer in order to even see the light of day. So I think we're much worse off right now than we were in the 1950s.
तुझे देखा तो ये जाना सनम प्यार होता है दीवाना सनम तुझे देखा तो ये जाना सनम.
Not just our laws, but popular culture itself repeatedly reinforces tropes of regulating women's desires, placing individual choice as firmly secondary to family, to societal approval. In the wildly popular Bollywood movie Dilwale Dulhania Le Jayenge, the film's protagonist, played by Shah Rukh Khan, refuses to marry his lady love without her father's approval. The movie follows Shah Rukh Khan's hilarious and emotional attempts to win his father in law's approval. Ultimately, however, the movie centers the two men in what is essentially a love story and places family approval over a woman's choice. Other movies, such as Sairat, a critically acclaimed Marathi movie, highlight the bloody consequences of centering individual choices in opposition to caste norms. Sadly, what seems obvious is that in negotiating religion, in negotiating the nation, the individual is forgotten for the community. The desires and love, especially of women, is subsumed under their duties and responsibilities. Thank you for listening to this episode of Contested Nation. If you like this episode, do not forget to like, share, and subscribe to the podcast, and do leave us a review.